And imagine that you are living in the 1770s on the vast lands of North America, yet still under the rule of the British Empire. Your daily life could be that of a farmer, a blacksmith, a merchant, or simply an ordinary person in a small village. You work tirelessly to provide for your family, but then anything you buy, from paper, liquor, sugar, to tea, comes with heavy taxes imposed by the British authorities. You hear news from the seafaring merchants. The British Parliament, thousands of miles away, is debating and passing laws without ever consulting the colonists. People begin whispering a phrase that is becoming increasingly common: no taxation without representation. The feeling of injustice spreads, but the discontent remains simmering until one day in Boston, where tensions between British soldiers and the public reach a peak. An angry crowd throws stones, clubs, and challenging words at the soldiers. Gunfire echoes. Blood spills onto the streets. That event, later known as the Boston Massacre, jolted all 13 colonies awake. But what would happen next? Only 3 years later, in 1773, a group of citizens, disguised as Native Americans, secretly made their way to Boston Harbor. They carried no weapons, but they carried their anger. Hundreds of barrels of British tea were thrown straight into the sea. The dark waves mingled with the pungent scent of tea, signaling an unavoidable confrontation. The Boston Tea Party was not merely an act of property destruction. It was a bell of defiance against the most powerful empire of the time. The British responded by enacting laws that the colonists called the Intolerable Acts. Boston Harbor was blockaded. The colony's self-governance was tightened. More and more troops landed. But instead of submitting, the colonies began reaching out to each other. For the first time, farmers, artisans, and separate communities stretching from Massachusetts to Georgia sat together at the First Continental Congress in 1774. From here, the story would no longer be about isolated cries of grievance. It would become a flame of unity. And then, just a year later, the first shots rang out at Lexington and Concord. History calls it the shot heard round the world, the moment that marked the beginning of a war no one thought that impoverished colonists could wage against the most powerful empire on the planet. The question arises, how could a small group of colonies with an almost untrained army manage to win and give birth to a new nation, the United States of America? That is the story of the American Revolution, and also the story of the birth of America that you are about to explore with me right now. Welcome to U.S. History. In today's video, we will explore together one of the most important periods in American history, the American Revolution. This was not just a war for independence, but also a turning point that gave birth to a new nation with ideas of liberty and democracy that changed the world. In the next 20 minutes, we will go through the entire journey, from the deep-rooted causes that led to discontent among the colonists, to the fierce battles between the mighty British Army and the still young militias. We will also meet important figures, from George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, to the unknown soldiers who sacrificed themselves for the first flag of freedom. Get ready to step into a dramatic story where daring decisions and courage created miracles. This is not just American history, but also the history of the idea of liberty, an idea that still resonates to this day. Shots rang out. The land of North America had been nothing more than distant colonies of the British Empire. From the early 17th century, ships carrying migrants, mostly poor farmers, persecuted religious believers, and merchants eager for opportunity, crossed the Atlantic to seek a new life. They established 13 colonies along what is now the east coast of the United States. At first glance, life here seemed peaceful. Fertile land, vast forests and mountains, abundant rivers. The colonists worked hard, building farms, establishing towns, expanding trade. But behind it all, supreme power still belonged to London. The British government appointed governors to manage each colony, enact laws, and collect taxes. For a long time, the colonists accepted that order. They enjoyed military protection from Britain, traded with European markets, and in some measure still considered themselves subjects of the British Crown. However, that loyalty gradually fractured as governing policies became increasingly heavy-handed. A major turning point came when the 7 Years' War, 1756 to 1763, ended. This war, known in North America as the French and Indian War, was part of a global conflict between Britain and France. The British emerged victorious, gaining vast territories in Canada and nearly eliminating French influence in North America. But that victory came at a tremendous cost, a staggering war debt. The British government turned to the colonies for revenue to cover the deficit. Colonists, accustomed to low taxes, suddenly faced new tax laws. And from this, the seeds of discontent began to sprout. Tax acts and waves of resistance. Immediately after the war, the British Parliament passed a series of policies to tighten control over the colonies. One of the first was the Sugar Act of 1764. This law taxed sugar, molasses, and many imported goods. For merchants, it was a severe blow because sugar and rum were among the most profitable items. Before they could adapt, the colonists faced the Stamp Act of 1765. Under it, all kinds of paper, from contracts, newspapers, and licenses to playing cards, required a British tax stamp. This was not only an economic burden, but also a blatant intrusion into everyday life. Protests erupted everywhere. Colonists hung effigies of British officials and burned them in the streets. Merchants boycotted imported British goods. Many civic groups emerged, the most famous being the Sons of Liberty, led by Samuel Adams. The slogan, "No taxation without representation," became a common cry. People believed that since they had no representatives in the British Parliament, that body had no right to tax them. Faced with fierce opposition, in 1766, the British Parliament was forced to repeal the Stamp Act. But immediately, they passed the Declaratory Act, asserting that Britain had full legislative authority over the colonies in all cases whatsoever. Soon after, new taxes appeared. The Townshend Act, 1767, taxed glass, paint, paper, and tea. Once again, boycotts spread widely. From women weaving cloth to replace imports, to coffeehouse owners serving only local products, everyone participated in the quiet resistance. The Boston Massacre and spreading fury. As opposition grew, Britain increased troop deployments to maintain order, especially in Boston, the center of the resistance movement. This bustling port city became a powder keg. On March 5, 1770, tensions erupted. A crowd surrounded British soldiers, throwing stones and shouting. In the chaos, shots were fired. 5 civilians were killed, including Crispus Attucks, a man of African and native descent, later recognized as the first martyr of the Revolution. The event was called the Boston Massacre. Colonial newspapers quickly portrayed it as evidence of British brutality. Paul Revere's engravings, showing British soldiers firing on unarmed crowds, circulated widely, fueling public outrage. After the event, the British Parliament temporarily repealed most of the Townshend taxes, except the tea tax, which would continue to spark a larger crisis. The Boston Tea Party and the Intolerable Acts. In 1773, the British Parliament passed the Tea Act, allowing the British East India Company to sell tea directly to the colonies at a lower price, but still with tax attached. Colonists saw this as a scheme to make them accept Britain's right to tax them. On the night of December 16, 1773, a group of Bostonians disguised as Native Americans quietly went down to the harbor,
They boarded 3 ships loaded with tea and threw all 342 chests into the sea. The waters churned, mingled with the strong scent of tea. This event became known in history as the Boston Tea Party. The British government was furious. In 1774, they passed a series of laws that colonists called the Coercive Acts, or the Intolerable Acts, closing the port of Boston until compensation was made, stripping Massachusetts of self-governance, and allowing British soldiers to quarter in private homes. Rather than subduing the colonies, these laws brought them closer together. From north to south, a spirit of unity began to form. The First Continental Congress, the first steps towards freedom. In September 1774, delegates from 12 colonies, excluding Georgia, met in Philadelphia for the event known as the First Continental Congress. This was the first time the colonies sat together to discuss common rights. They drafted a petition to King George III demanding the repeal of harsh laws. At the same time, they called for a comprehensive boycott of British goods if their demands were not met. Although independence was not yet declared, the meeting marked a turning point. For the first time, the colonies realized the power of unity. By early 1775, the situation was tense as a string stretched about to snap. In Boston, British troops were increasing. In New England villages, militias secretly drilled. In coffee houses, churches, and town squares, people constantly debated, was compromise with Britain still possible, or had the time come to take up arms? No one knew that just a few months later, the first shots at Lexington and Concord would ring out, beginning a revolution that would change the course of human history.
Beginning of 1775, the atmosphere in the American colonies became suffocatingly tense. Thousands of colonists secretly trained in military drills, forming small militia groups throughout the countryside. They called each other by a simple but proud name: Minutemen, those ready in just 1 minute. In Boston and other cities, British troops grew in number. They patrolled the streets, searched for militia weapon stores, and suppressed any sign of rebellion. The colonists knew that conflict would come sooner or later, and in fact, it did not wait long. In April 1775, the first shots were fired at Lexington and Concord, opening an 8-year-long war for independence. But what made farmers and craftsmen dare to rise against the most powerful empire in the world? It was the combination of economic injustice, a sense of liberty, and the spirit of unity, factors that had been smoldering for years. In this section, we will explore in detail each battle, each strategy, and the figures who shaped the turning points of the revolution. Lexington and Concord, the shot heard around the world. On April 19, 1775, a group of Massachusetts militia was patrolling around Lexington. Suddenly, they encountered a fully armed British force entering the village to seize militia weapons. In a tense moment, a shot rang out. No one knew exactly who fired first, but those gunshots became a symbol. The shot heard around the world. The militia suffered casualties, but other groups gathered quickly at Concord. Skirmishes broke out along roads and forests. The British, shocked by the fierce resistance, were forced to retreat, suffering heavy losses. The victory at Lexington and Concord inspired the other colonies. They realized that if united, they could resist the strongest professional army on the planet. George Washington and the formation of the Continental Army. Right after the first battles, colonial leaders decided that a unified army was necessary. The Second Continental Congress convened in May 1775 and appointed George Washington, a veteran officer from Virginia, as commander-in-chief of the Continental Army. Washington was not only a skilled tactical commander, but also a symbol of unity among the colonies. Though the army was young, poorly equipped, and lacking discipline, his leadership inspired thousands of soldiers and militiamen. Washington recognized that the war would not be won solely by military strength, but also by fighting spirit, patience, and the ability to mobilize resources from the people. He built systems of intelligence, logistics, and strategic planning to face the better-equipped British. The Declaration of Independence and political meaning. On July 4th, 1776, the Declaration of Independence was announced, opening a new chapter for the colonies. Drafted by Thomas Jefferson, it declared that all men are created equal and that all have the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. The Declaration was not only a political statement, it was also a spiritual weapon. It transformed the war from a tax rebellion into a struggle for human freedom and dignity. The colonies, despite many difficulties, realized that they were facing a cause greater than themselves. They were creating a new nation, built on principles of democracy and justice. Key battles: Bunker Hill, Trenton, and Saratoga. 1. Battle of Bunker Hill, 1775. Massachusetts militia seized the Bunker Hill high ground to block British advances into Boston. Though the British eventually took the position, they suffered heavy losses. This battle proved that American militia could stand against professional British troops. 2. Battle of Trenton, 1776. After defeat in New York, the American army retreated across the Delaware River. Washington launched a surprise attack on Hessian troops on Christmas 1776, winning a resounding victory that boosted American morale. 3. Battle of Saratoga, 1777. This decisive victory persuaded France to ally with America, providing military and naval aid and changing the course of the war. Each battle was not just a military victory, but also evidence of the Continental Army's fighting ability, perseverance, and strategy. International assistance and diplomatic strategy. The victory at Saratoga marked a major turning point. France officially supported America with troops, warships, and funding. Spain and the Netherlands also joined, weakening Britain's resources. As a result, the war was no longer confined to American soil. Britain had to spread its forces to defend other colonies. Washington and other generals took advantage of this, launching guerrilla campaigns to wear down enemy numbers. Moreover, the spirit of the American people remained crucial. Despite shortages of food, weapons, and supplies, they endured, driven by faith in independence and liberty. The war was not yet over, but the colonies had proven they were not just small oppressed peoples. From the battles of Lexington and Concord, Bunker Hill, Trenton, and Saratoga, unity, determination, and the ability to mobilize all resources created a truly formidable force. Washington and other generals not only led the army with tactics, but also inspired and sustained the people's spirit in the hardest times. France, Spain, and the Netherlands began providing aid, creating the real possibility of American victory. The war had entered a decisive stage. The story of triumphs, sacrifices, and brilliant strategies will lead us to part 3, the final victory, where America officially wins independence and lays the foundation for a new nation.
After many years of fighting, the American Revolutionary War entered a decisive phase. The fierce battles, the continuous sacrifices of the militia and the Continental Army, along with international assistance, created a real opportunity for America to gain independence. The British, though still superior in equipment and numbers, had to face a flexible militia force, strong fighting spirit, and the ability to apply guerrilla strategy. The skillful moves of George Washington and the generals helped the Continental Army maintain morale, making the most of every small victory to inspire all the colonies. In this section, we will explore the major campaigns, decisive battles such as Yorktown, the assistance of allies, and finally, the Treaty of Paris 1783, the official document recognizing the independence of the United States of America. At the same time, we will also discover the spiritual and political legacy that the revolution left behind, from creating a new nation to inspiring other revolutions around the world. The Southern Campaign and Yorktown. One of the major turning points took place in the South. In 1780, the British decided to concentrate their forces in the South, hoping to conquer the colonies where they still had many loyalists. However, the Continental Army, combined with local militias, continuously launched guerrilla attacks, wearing down the British and disrupting their plan for a quick occupation. The battles at Guildford Courthouse and Kings Mountain proved that although the Americans were weak in numbers, with reasonable strategy, they could effectively weaken the enemy. The most important turning point was the Battle of Yorktown in 1781. Washington, together with the Marquis de Lafayette, with support from the French Navy under Admiral Comte de Grasse, completely surrounded the British Army under General Cornwallis. The British were isolated, lacking food and without supply lines. The trenches, minefields, and encirclement strategy of the American-French forces made escape impossible. After weeks of fighting, Cornwallis had to surrender in October 1781, marking America's decisive victory. The Battle of Yorktown was not only a military victory, but also proof that a small national force could defeat a great empire thanks to strategy, spirit, and international allies. The Treaty of Paris 1783, recognition of independence. After the victory at Yorktown, Britain gradually lost the will to continue the war. In 1783, negotiations in Paris led to the Treaty of Paris, which officially recognized the independence of the United States of America. Key provisions. Britain recognized the colonies as an independent nation. The United States gained control of the land from the Atlantic Ocean to the Mississippi River. Fishing rights in Canadian waters were guaranteed. The Treaty of Paris not only ended the war, but also opened a new era for America, where they had the right to determine their destiny, build their own government and laws. It also proved that the will and unity of the people could change history. The key figures and their roles. The revolution did not rely only on numbers or strategy. Historical figures played extremely important roles. 1. George Washington, Commander-in-Chief, a symbol of perseverance, strategy, and leadership. 2. Thomas Jefferson, author of the Declaration of Independence, the thinker who opened ideals of liberty and equality. 3. Benjamin Franklin, diplomat who persuaded France to support America, helping change the course of the war. 4. The Marquis de Lafayette, a young French volunteer who linked French and American forces in many key battles. 5. The unnamed soldiers and militias, those who created every small victory, inspiring the community and history. The combination of leadership talent, courageous spirit, and international support was the decisive factor in victory. The legacy of the American Revolution. The American Revolution left many lessons and legacies. Creating a democratic nation, a government system based on the principle of separation of powers and protection of civil rights. Declaration of Liberty Rights. Values of freedom, equality, and human rights became new standards. Global inspiration. The American Revolution inspired the French Revolution, independence movements in Latin America, and many other places. Affirming unity and the will of the people. The American people proved that though young and lacking weapons, with unity they could change history. These values not only influenced America, but also shaped democratic and revolutionary thought across the world. The war ended, but the story did not stop there. The young United States had to face the challenge of building a new government, establishing a constitution, and balancing power between the federal government and the states. But the most important thing that the revolution left behind was the will for freedom and the spirit of independence. From the shots at Lexington to the victory at Yorktown, from the Declaration of Independence to the Treaty of Paris, this story is not only American history, but also the history of timeless ideas, proving the power of the human spirit and the strength of unity. These values still echo today, reminding us that freedom and justice never come easily, but are always worth fighting for and protecting.
When looking back at more than a decade of struggle, from the early injustices such as the stamp tax, the sugar tax, the Townshend Acts, to the Boston Massacre and the Boston Tea Party, we realize that the American Revolution did not happen in a day, but was the result of a long process. This is the story of ordinary people with extraordinary will. Farmers, craftsmen, merchants, and spiritual leaders stood together, fighting not only with weapons, but also with ideas and the spirit of unity. The victory at Yorktown and the recognition of independence in the Treaty of Paris, 1783, proved that those efforts were not in vain. America became the first free nation born from a revolution against empire, opening a new chapter for humanity. The American Revolution left many timeless lessons. 1. Democratic system of government. The U.S. Constitution, the principles of separation of powers and the protection of civil rights became standards for other nations. 2. The value of freedom and equality. The Declaration of Independence was not only a legal document, but a symbol of human rights and the right of nations to self-determination. 3. The spirit of unity and perseverance. Americans proved that even young, poorly equipped forces, if united, could still defeat a powerful empire. 4. Global influence. The American Revolution inspired revolutionary movements in France, Latin America, and many other places around the world. These values not only existed in history, but still strongly influence how we understand freedom, human rights, and the democratic spirit today. The American Revolution is living proof that ideas can change the world. Ordinary people with determination and courage made history, leaving behind a nation and values admired by the whole world. When looking at the journey from Lexington, Concord, Bunker Hill, Trenton, Saratoga to Yorktown, we clearly see the power of unity, the will for freedom, and intelligent strategy. These lessons are not only for America, but are an inspiration for all of us, reminding us that freedom and justice never come easily, but are always worth fighting for and protecting. If you love history, want to deeply understand the events, figures, and strategies that shaped America, follow the U.S. History Channel to not miss detailed, long, and fascinating documentary videos. Hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell to always stay updated with dramatic and valuable history stories.